The stars over Earth flickered faintly through the haze of orbital debris that had once been humanity's proud fleet. Shattered hulls and twisted metal drifted silently, a graveyard of resistance. Below, the planet bore scars far deeper than the wounds of war. Cities reduced to ash, oceans polluted with the remains of fallen stations, and forests scorched black. All were silent witnesses to humanity's stubborn defiance against the Galactic Empire. Standing on the observation deck of the last functional stronghold, Captain Cale Draven stared out into the void. His reflection in the reinforced glass mirrored his grim determination. Cale's face was lined with the burden of countless decisions, some calculated, some desperate, but all aimed at protecting what little remained of the human race. His dark eyes burned with an unyielding fire, a stark contrast to the desolate landscape behind him. "Are you sure about this, Captain?" asked Lieutenant Mira Voss, her voice steady, but laced with a tinge of concern. She stood at his side, a stalwart presence in the chaos. Her tactical vest bore the wear of constant battles, her left arm still bandaged from the last skirmish. Mira had been with Cale since the early days of the Resistance, a trusted ally and fierce tactician. Cale didn't turn to her. Instead, he let his gaze linger on the vastness of space where he knew the Empire's fleet would soon appear. "They've left us no choice, Mira," he replied, his tone as resolute as stone. "The Empire views mercy as weakness. If we beg, they'll annihilate us. If we fight, at least they'll remember us." Mira nodded, her jaw tightening. She wanted to argue, to suggest alternatives, but the reality was stark. Humanity was down to its last city, its last defenders. They couldn't run. They couldn't hide. All that remained was defiance. Cale turned, his dark combat uniform catching the faint light of the room. "Transmit the message," he ordered. Mira hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She stepped to the control panel, her fingers flying over the console. A low hum filled the room as the ancient comm system powered up. The signal, fragile and barely functional, would carry Cale's words to the far reaches of the galaxy, straight to the heart of the Empire. It was a desperate move, but desperation had defined humanity's struggle for years. Cale stepped into the center of the room, his posture rigid, his voice cold and deliberate. "This is Captain Cale Draven, commander of Earth's defense. To the Galactic Empire, I have only one message. Leave Earth, or your worlds will burn." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. His tone grew sharper, laced with the anger of a man who had seen his people hunted to the brink of extinction. "You have underestimated us for too long. You thought we were a nuisance, an infestation to be eradicated. But you are wrong. Humanity has survived fire and ruin before, and if you come for us again, you will face the consequences of your arrogance." The final words echoed through the room, reverberating in the tense silence that followed. Mira glanced at Cale, then back at the console. The message had been sent. Now all they could do was wait. "Do you think they'll even care?" Mira asked quietly. Cale exhaled slowly, his gaze once again drifting to the stars. "They'll care, not because they fear us, but because they can't stand the idea of defiance. The Empire thrives on control. They won't let this stand." As if summoned by his words, a distant alert chimed through the stronghold systems. Mira moved swiftly to the console, her eyes scanning the data. "Sensors are picking up movement," she said, her voice tightening. "It's them." Cale clenched his fists, his jaw set. "How long?" "Less than a day," Mira replied grimly. "Their fleet is massive, Captain. We're outgunned 10-1, and that's a generous estimate." Cale nodded, unflinching. "Then we make every shot count. Assemble the team in the war room. We have preparations to finalize." Mira hesitated, then saluted sharply. "Yes, sir." As she left, Cale lingered in the observation deck, the weight of leadership pressing heavily on his shoulders. The ruins of Earth below were a stark reminder of everything they had lost, and everything they were still fighting for. He thought of the millions who had once thrived on this planet, of the children who would never know what it meant to grow up under blue skies, of the sacrifices made by countless warriors who had fallen to give humanity this one last chance. He closed his eyes, letting the memories fuel his resolve. The Empire might have crushed Earth's fleets, obliterated its cities, and scattered its people, but they had not extinguished its spirit. Kale-Draven would ensure that humanity's defiance would echo through the galaxy, a warning to anyone who dared challenge them. In the depths of the stronghold, the war room buzzed with activity. Tactical displays projected holographic images of the incoming fleet, their sheer size dwarfing Earth's meager defenses. Officers barked orders, technicians worked feverishly to patch up damaged systems, and soldiers prepared for the battle ahead. Kale entered the room, his presence commanding instant attention. The chatter quieted as he stepped to the central table, where a holographic projection of the battlefield flickered. Mira and Dr. Ilara Kane, the lead scientist responsible for Earth's last-ditch weapon, stood waiting. "Ilara," Kale said, addressing the older woman. Her graying hair was tied back, her face lined with years of sleepless nights spent designing and refining the weapon that could either save humanity or doom it completely. "What's the status of the Inferno Protocol?" Ilara hesitated, her voice measured but firm. "It's functional, but the power core is unstable. If we activate it, there's no going back. It will devastate anything within range, including us, if we're not careful." Kyle nodded grimly. "Understood. We'll only use it as a last resort." He turned to the gathered officers and soldiers. "Listen up. The Empire thinks we're finished. They think they've beaten us. But they've forgotten one thing. Humans don't quit. We're going to make them bleed for every inch. They'll remember Earth not as a conquest, but as the graveyard of their arrogance." The room erupted in cheers and shouts of determination. For a brief moment, Kyle allowed himself to believe they might have a chance. He caught Mira's eye and gave a faint nod. She returned it with a steely gaze, the unspoken bond of comrades who had been through hell together. As the final preparations began, Kale stepped away from the table, his mind racing through contingencies and plans. He knew the odds were against them. He knew many would not survive the coming battle. But he also knew one undeniable truth. Humanity's spirit was unbreakable, and if the Empire wanted to extinguish it, they would have to pay a price so steep it would echo across the stars. For now, Kale-Draven prepared for what he knew would be humanity's finest, and perhaps final, hour. The Dominion's wrath floated in the cold void of space, a massive juggernaut of imperial design. Its sleek obsidian hull shimmered faintly with an alien energy that pulsed like a heartbeat. The ship was the pride of the Galactic Empire, a weaponized planet capable of unleashing destruction on an unimaginable scale. Aboard its command deck, High Executor Varric stood with arms crossed, his expression a mix of disdain and amusement. "Humans," Varric muttered, his voice a low growl that carried through the silent deck. "They truly are the cockroaches of this galaxy." Behind him, a cluster of advisors nodded, their features pale and uniform, a stark contrast to the towering executor. Varric was an Avarian, a species renowned for their cunning and cruelty. His crimson eyes gleamed with malice as he gazed at the holographic projection of Earth. Its once blue surface was now marred by scars of war, a dying world stubbornly clinging to life. "This is the best they can muster," Varric sneered, gesturing at the faint energy readings from Earth's last defenses. "They dare to threaten the Empire with their feeble warnings? Send our reply." The nearest advisor, a wiry Vorthaxian with translucent skin, bowed. "Executor, we've intercepted their signal. Shall I prepare a broadcast?" "No," Varric snapped. "Their arrogance does not deserve the courtesy of words. Let our fleet be the answer." As if on command, the Dominion's wrath surged forward, its propulsion engines igniting with a quiet menace. Behind it, an endless fleet of Imperial warships emerged from hyperspace, their configurations varied but united by the glowing insignia of the Empire emblazoned on their hulls. Each ship dwarfed the remnants of Earth's defenses, their polished metal and advanced weaponry a testament to the Empire's technological superiority. On board one of the smaller cruisers, Lieutenant Arik Tan adjusted his helmet and glanced nervously at the growing silhouette of Earth. He was a junior officer, new to the Empire's war machine, and while he had been trained to despise humanity, the stories he'd heard unnerved him. Tales of humans fighting against impossible odds, refusing to surrender even when all hope was lost, lingered in his mind. It seemed foolish, even reckless, but there was something in their defiance that made him uneasy. "Eyes forward, Tan," barked his commanding officer, a stern-faced Drexian who had seen countless campaigns. "The humans are cornered animals. They'll fight hard, but they're already dead. This is just a matter of cleaning up the mess." Tan nodded but couldn't shake the pit in his stomach. He turned his gaze back to Earth, wondering if this campaign would truly be as simple as the Empire claimed. On Earth, the Stronghold's war room was alive with activity. The incoming fleet's signal had grown stronger, and the tactical displays now showed the full extent of the Empire's forces. The holographic table flickered with projections of hundreds of ships, each marked with cold, red light. "They're moving into formation," Mira reported, her voice steady but clipped. Her sharp eyes scanned the data as her fingers danced across the controls. "The Dominion's wrath is leading the charge. If they engage with their primary weapon, we're finished." Kale leaned over the table, his expression unreadable. "They won't waste the wrath on us immediately," he said. "They'll want to test our defenses first. Their arrogance will buy us time." Dr. Alara Kane stepped forward, her voice breaking through the tension. "The Inferno protocol is calibrated," she said, "but activating it prematurely could destabilize the core. We need to draw them in closer." Kale nodded. "We will. They'll underestimate us, like they always have." He straightened and looked around the room, his voice rising with authority. "Focus fire on their smaller ships. We don't have the resources to take on the Wrath head-on. Force them to commit more of their fleet, make them think we're desperate." Mira glanced at him. "Isn't that the truth?" Kyle allowed a faint smirk to cross his face. "It is, but we'll make them pay for every second of it." The war room fell into a tense rhythm of preparation. Soldiers armed themselves with scavenged weapons, technicians scrambled to reinforce failing systems, and pilots readied their battered ships. Cal moved through the ranks, his presence a quiet reassurance to his people. Though outnumbered and outgunned, they drew strength from their commander's unshakable resolve. High above, the Empire's fleet closed in. The first volley came without warning, a barrage of plasma beams and ion torpedoes streaking through space, tearing into the remnants of Earth's orbital defenses. Explosions lit the sky as satellites and debris were vaporized, the shockwaves rattling the stronghold below. Cal watched the destruction unfold on the displays. "Hold fire," he ordered, his voice calm despite the chaos. "Let them think we're scrambling." Mira shot him a questioning look but obeyed. Seconds stretched into agonizing minutes. As the Empire's ships pressed closer, their confidence growing with every unchallenged strike. "Now," Kyle said, his voice sharp, "return fire. Target their flanks." The stronghold's defenses roared to life, a sudden eruption of energy cannons and missile salvos. The attack was surgical, catching the Empire's fleet off guard. Two of their smaller cruisers erupted into flames, their wreckage spiraling into the void. Another ship veered off course, its engines crippled. On the Dominion's wrath, Executor Varick's smug expression darkened. "What are they playing at?" he snarled. "Focus all fire on their stronghold. Crush them." The Empire's fleet adjusted, unleashing a concentrated barrage at the surface. Shields flickered and groaned under the strain, but Kale's forces held their ground. "They're overcommitting," Mira noted, a hint of triumph in her voice. "They didn't expect us to hit back." Kale's eyes remained on the tactical display. They never do. As the battle raged, the Stronghold scanners picked up a subtle but alarming signal. A single Imperial shuttle had broken from the fleet and was heading toward the surface. Mira frowned, narrowing her eyes at the display. "That's odd. They wouldn't send a shuttle down unless—" Her words caught in her throat. Kale turned to her sharply. "Unless what?" "Unless they already know where to strike," she said. "The traitor. They're delivering coordinates to the Empire." Kale's expression darkened. "Intercept that shuttle. Now." Mira moved swiftly, issuing orders to a nearby squad. "Don't let them reach the surface. If they get those coordinates to the Wrath, we're done. Kale clenched his fists, his mind racing. The Empire's fleet was bearing down on them, and now a traitor threatened to expose their last line of defense. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of the storm. Through the stronghold's thick walls, the distant rumble of explosions reverberated. Kyle stared at the holographic display of the Dominion's wrath, its ominous presence a stark reminder of the odds they faced. "This is just the opening act," he muttered to himself. "The real battle hasn't even begun." The stronghold shuddered violently as another barrage from the Empire's fleet slammed into the atmosphere. Dust rained down from the ceiling of the war room, but Captain Cale Draven barely flinched. His focus remained locked on the holographic display, where a red icon pulsed ominously, a single Imperial shuttle descending toward Earth. "Status report!" Cale barked, his voice cutting through the tension. Lieutenant Mira Voss worked furiously at the console, her brow furrowed. "The shuttle's trajectory is erratic, but it's heading for the western quadrant. That's dangerously close to our energy relays." Cale's jaw tightened. The energy relays powered the stronghold's shields. If the Empire gained access to them, it would leave Earth's last defenses exposed. "Do we have an intercept team in place?" he asked. "Squad Theta is en route," Mira confirmed, her tone clipped. "But if they're carrying intel about our defenses—" "They're not just carrying it," Cale interrupted. His gaze hardened, his instincts honed by years of battle. "Someone down here gave it to them." Mira froze for a fraction of a second, her hands hovering over the console. "You think the traitor is in the stronghold?" Cale nodded grimly. "No one outside these walls could know the location of the relays. We have a leak, and they just handed the Empire the keys to our survival." Across the room, Dr. Alara Kane, the scientist behind the Inferno Protocol, stepped forward. Her usually calm demeanor was tinged with unease. "If they disable the relays, we won't be able to hold the shields long enough to deploy the protocol. We'll be exposed before we even have a chance to retaliate." Kyle turned to Mira, his voice low and firm. "Get me a list of everyone with access to the relay schematics. Cross-reference it with recent communications logs and movement records. Whoever this traitor is, they've left a trail." Mira nodded, already pulling up the data. "Understood. I'll narrow it down." Cale stepped away from the table, his fists clenched. The weight of betrayal was heavy, but he couldn't allow it to distract him. Lives were at stake, and time was running out. The shuttle streaked through the atmosphere, its sleek design cutting through the turbulence like a knife. Inside, Imperial Lieutenant Arik Tan gripped the controls, his face pale but determined. This mission was unlike anything he had trained for, delivering critical intelligence directly to the Empire's ground forces. The data, encrypted on a small device hidden in his uniform, contained the precise locations of Earth's energy relays and weak points in their shield system. The traitor's message had been clear: ensure this information reached the Empire at all costs. But as the shuttle descended, Tan couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. Humans were unpredictable, defiant. He had heard the stories, seen the footage of their desperate resistance, and now he was flying straight into their territory. The shuttle's proximity alarm blared, snapping Tan out of his thoughts. On his display, a trio of human interceptors appeared, their battered but functional ships closing in fast. "Here they come," he muttered, adjusting the controls. "Let's see how far you'll go to stop me." "Enemy shuttle spotted," came the voice of Lieutenant Grace Torin, the leader of Squad Theta, through the comms. Her interceptor sped toward the shuttle, its engines roaring. "It's fast, but nothing we can't handle. Permission to engage?" "Granted," Mira's voice replied from the stronghold. "Neutralize it before it reaches the western quadrant." Torin's hands flew over the controls, her ship weaving through the turbulence. "Copy that. Theta Squad on me." The three interceptors closed in, their weapons locking onto the shuttle. Torin fired first, a barrage of energy blasts streaking toward the target. The shuttle banked hard, narrowly evading the attack. "He's a slippery one," Torin muttered. "Theta 2, cut him off from below. Theta 3, cover his escape vector." The interceptors moved in tandem, their coordination seamless. The shuttle twisted and turned, but its evasive maneuvers grew increasingly desperate. Finally, a well-placed shot from Torin's wingman struck its left engine, sending it spiraling toward the surface. "Direct hit," Torin reported, a hint of triumph in her voice. "Shuttle's going down. We'll confirm the crash site." Mira's voice crackled back. "Good work. Be cautious. If the pilot survives, they'll be armed." "Understood," Torin replied. "Theta Squad, prepare for ground engagement." Back in the stronghold, Mira's fingers flew across the console as she cross-referenced the data Kale had requested. The logs painted a troubling picture. Small discrepancies in maintenance schedules, unauthorized access to restricted files, and unaccounted movements during critical operations. A name kept appearing: Commander Dax Renar. Mira's stomach sank. Renar was one of Kale's closest advisors, a decorated officer who had served alongside him since the early days of the Resistance. The idea that he could be the traitor was almost unthinkable. "Kyle," Mira called, her voice heavy with reluctance. "I think I found our leak." Kyle turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Who?" She hesitated, then brought up the data on the central display. "Commander Renar, the logs are clear. He's been accessing files he shouldn't, and his movements match the timing of the Empire's attacks." Kyle's expression darkened. "Renar?" His voice was low, almost disbelieving. "He's been with us since the beginning. Why would he—" Ilara interrupted, her voice cold and analytical. "Because loyalty doesn't survive desperation. If he thinks the Empire can offer him something we can't, safety, power, survival, then betrayal becomes a logical choice." Kale's hands curled into fists. "Where is he now?" "His last logged location was the Western Quadrant," Mira replied. "He could be trying to cover his tracks." Kale didn't hesitate. "Assemble a team. We're bringing him in." On the surface, the wreckage of the Imperial shuttle smoldered against the barren landscape. Torin and her squad approached cautiously, their weapons raised. The crash had left a deep scar in the earth, but the shuttle's cockpit was intact. "Be ready," Torin warned, her voice low. The squad moved in, their movements precise and disciplined. As Torin reached the cockpit, she saw the pilot slumped over the controls, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. She motioned to her team. "Secure the data. I'll handle the pilot." As her team moved to retrieve the device, Torin leaned closer to the pilot. His eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment she saw fear in them, a reminder that, despite the uniform, he was still mortal. "Don't move," Torin said firmly, her weapon trained on him. "You're coming with us." The pilot groaned, but didn't resist. Torin's team secured the encrypted device, and within minutes, they were retreating back to their interceptors. The mission was a success, but Torin couldn't shake the feeling that this was only a small piece of a much larger puzzle. Back in the stronghold, Kale and Mira confronted Commander Renar in the war room. The evidence was laid out before him: files accessed, unauthorized transmissions, and his presence near critical locations during sabotage. Renar's expression was calm, almost detached, as he faced Kale. "You don't understand," he said, his voice steady. "This was never about betrayal. It's about survival. The Empire gave me a choice: cooperate or watch them annihilate everything." Kale's fist clenched, his anger barely contained. "You handed them our defenses, our people. You've doomed us all." Renar's gaze didn't waver. "They would have won anyway. I just bought us a chance to negotiate." Kyle stepped closer, his voice a dangerous whisper. "You don't negotiate with monsters. You fight them." With a single motion, Kale drew his sidearm. The room fell silent as he raised it, aiming directly at Renar. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then, Kale pulled the trigger. The sound echoed through the war room, followed by a heavy silence. Kale lowered the weapon, his expression unreadable. "We don't have time for traitors," he said coldly. "Prepare for the next wave." As the team dispersed, Kale's resolve only hardened. The Empire was coming, and now more than ever he was determined to show them the cost of underestimating humanity. The air in the war room crackled with a tense energy. The traitor had been dealt with, but his betrayal had left deep scars. Commander Renard's actions had compromised vital defense plans, and while the pilot's data from the intercepted shuttle had been retrieved, Cale knew the Empire wouldn't hesitate to press their advantage. The odds were growing steeper with every passing moment, but Kyle also knew one undeniable truth. Desperation had a way of sharpening the mind. "We can't wait for them to dictate the next move," Cale said, his voice resolute as he addressed the gathered officers. The holographic table displayed the Empire's fleet, now moving into a more aggressive formation. "We need to disrupt their rhythm, hit them hard and fast where they least expect it." Lieutenant Miravoss, standing beside him, nodded in agreement. "A targeted strike," she suggested. "We know the Empire's smaller cruisers are running point for the Dominion's wrath. If we cripple one of them, it could force their flagship to redeploy resources." Cale leaned forward, studying the hologram intently. "Not just any cruiser. We need a high-value target, something that would make them hesitate." Dr. Alara Kane, her voice calm but urgent, interjected. "The cruiser Irindus. It's carrying critical supply chains and fuel reserves for the fleet. Without it, their forward momentum would stall." Cale's lips curled into a grim smile. "Perfect. If we hit the Irindus, we buy ourselves time and force them to react. But we need precision. One mistake, and we'll waste resources we can't afford to lose." Mira crossed her arms, her sharp gaze locking onto Cale. "You're planning to lead this strike personally, aren't you?" Cale didn't answer immediately. He let the silence settle over the room, his decision already made. "I'll take a team," he said finally. "This mission needs to succeed, and I won't risk sending anyone else to do it." Mira's expression tightened, but she knew better than to argue. "Then I'm coming with you," she said firmly. Cale met her gaze, his respect for her unwavering. "Fine. Get the best pilots we have. We leave in 30 minutes." The hangar buzzed with frantic activity as technicians and engineers prepared the strike force. Humanity's remaining fleet was a patchwork of salvaged ships, their hulls scarred and mismatched from decades of battle. Kyle's fighter, the Resolute, stood at the center, its blackened metal gleaming under the flickering lights. Despite its age, the ship was a testament to human ingenuity, fast, agile, and outfitted with enough firepower to challenge even the Empire's advanced designs. Kyle climbed into the cockpit, the familiar hum of the engines greeting him like an old friend. Beside him, Mira's voice crackled through the comms. "Strike team ready, Captain. Theta Squadron is standing by." "Understood," Cale replied, his hands steady on the controls. "This is a surgical mission. We hit the Irindus, cripple its engines, and get out before they can react. No unnecessary risks." A chorus of affirmations came through the comms as the strike team prepared for launch. Cale's gaze swept over the hangar one last time, taking in the determined faces of his crew. These were men and women who had lost everything, families, homes, futures, but they still fought, not out of duty, but out of defiance. "Launch sequence initiated," Mira announced. "See you in the stars, Captain." Kyle smirked faintly. "Try to keep up, Lieutenant." The Resolute roared to life, its engines blazing as it shot out of the hangar. The rest of the strike team followed, a dozen ships streaking into the void. For a moment, the silence of space enveloped them, the vast emptiness both awe-inspiring and suffocating. Then, the Empire's fleet came into view, a shimmering wall of destruction stretching across the horizon. Cale's voice broke the silence. "Mark your targets. Stay tight and watch for incoming fire." The strike team veered toward the Irindus, its sleek frame glowing with the energy shields that protected its vulnerable systems. Imperial fighters swarmed around it, their movements precise and disciplined. It was a stark contrast to the ragtag human fleet, but Cale knew the Empire's weakness. They didn't expect creativity. They relied on overwhelming force, not adaptability. The first wave of enemy fighters surged forward, their weapons blazing. Kyle rolled the Resolute, dodging a barrage of plasma fire as he lined up his sights on an incoming ship. With a squeeze of the trigger, twin energy blasts tore through its hull, sending it spiraling into oblivion. "Good shot," Mira's voice chimed in, her own ship weaving through the chaos. "But don't get cocky." Wouldn't dream of it, Kyle replied, his focus unyielding. The strike team pressed forward, their formation tight as they broke through the enemy lines. Explosions erupted around them, fragments of ships and debris scattering like deadly shrapnel. The Arindis loomed ahead, its size dwarfing the human fighters. Kale's hands tightened on the controls. "Target their engines," he commanded. "We need to disable their propulsion systems." The team moved as one, unleashing a coordinated assault on the Arindis. Missiles streaked through the void, colliding with the cruiser's shields in bursts of light. The shields flickered, strained under the relentless barrage. "Shields are weakening," Mira reported. "Another pass should do it." Kale looped the Resolute around, dodging enemy fire as he lined up his next attack. "Theta 3, cover my flank. Mira, focus on their rear engines." "On it," Mira replied, her ship darting toward the cruiser's vulnerable underbelly. The Resolute dove in, its weapons blazing as Kale targeted the cruiser's primary engines. The shields gave way under the assault, and with a deafening explosion, one of the engines erupted into flames. "Direct hit!" Mira shouted. "Their propulsion is compromised." Kyle didn't celebrate. "Fall back. We've done enough damage. Let's not push our luck." As the strike team pulled away, the Arindis floundered, its remaining engines sputtering as it struggled to maintain its position. The Imperial fighters scrambled to protect the crippled cruiser, their focus shifting away from the human fleet. "Mission accomplished," Kale said, his voice calm but tinged with relief. "Return to base." Back in the stronghold, the mood was tense but victorious. The destruction of the Arindis had bought humanity precious time, forcing the Empire to regroup and reassess their strategy. Kale and Mira stood in the war room reviewing the battle footage. "They didn't see it coming," Mira said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "That cruiser was vital to their supply chain. It'll take them days to recover." "Days we'll use to prepare," Kale replied. His gaze shifted to the holographic projection of the Dominion's wrath. Despite their success, the Empire's flagship remained an ominous presence, its sheer size and power a constant reminder of the odds they faced. Mira glanced at him, her expression softening. "You did good out there, Kale. We all did." Kale didn't respond immediately. He stared at the projection, his mind already racing with the next steps. "This was just a skirmish," he said finally. "The real battle is still ahead, and we'll need more than luck to survive it." Mira nodded, her determination matching his. "Then we'd better get to work." Kyle allowed himself a rare moment of hope. The fight was far from over, but for now humanity had struck a blow. They had reminded the Empire that Earth's spirit was not so easily broken, and as long as that spirit burned, there was still a chance for survival. The stronghold was quieter now, but the air was heavy with unease. The mission to cripple the Arindis had been a success, but the cost of the traitor's betrayal loomed large. Repairs were underway, teams were scrambling to fortify defenses, and the faint hum of activity buzzed in every corridor. Yet within the war room, the atmosphere was colder, darker. Kale Draven stood at the head of the central table, his expression carved from stone. The others in the room, Lieutenant Mira Voss, Dr. Ilara Kane, and a handful of senior officers, were silent, waiting for the inevitable. Kale's gaze bore down on Commander Dax Renar, who sat in a chair, wrists bound, his face eerily calm despite the situation. Renar, once a respected leader among Earth's defenders, was now an exposed traitor. The evidence against him was irrefutable: unauthorized access to restricted files, suspicious movement patterns, and transmissions intercepted by Mira's team. He had fed the Empire vital information, including the locations of key defenses and energy relays. Yet Renar sat there as if he hadn't just doomed his people to near annihilation. Kale broke the silence first, his voice cold and cutting. "You betrayed us." Renar raised his head, meeting Kale's glare with an unsettling composure. "I did what I thought was necessary." "Necessary?" Kale repeated, his tone laced with venom. "You handed the Empire our defenses. You gave them the tools to destroy us. How is that necessary?" Renar's expression hardened, a flicker of defiance crossing his face. "Because fighting them is pointless. You know that as well as I do, Kale. They have the numbers, The technology, the resources. All we have are scraps and stubborn pride. I didn't betray humanity. I tried to save it. Mira, standing to Kale's right, stepped forward, her voice sharp. By selling us out? By sending our people to their deaths? Don't dress this up as some noble sacrifice, Renar. You're nothing but a coward. Renar's jaw tightened. Call me what you want. I've seen what the Empire does to its enemies. I've seen entire planets reduced to ash, species wiped from existence. Do you think they'll stop just because you crippled one of their cruisers? You're deluding yourselves. The only way to survive is to submit. Kale slammed his fists on the table, the sound echoing through the room. Submission isn't survival. It's slavery. You didn't just betray us. You betrayed every man, woman, and child still fighting for their lives. You handed them over to the slaughterhouse. Renar's calm facade began to crack. And what do you think you're doing? You think you can win this war? With what? Half a dozen barely functioning ships and a planet that's already half dead? Wake up, Kyle. This isn't defiance. It's suicide. Kale's eyes burned with fury, but his voice remained steady. Maybe it is, but I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees. The room fell silent again, the weight of Kale's words settling over everyone present. Even Renar, for all his defiance, seemed momentarily at a loss. Kale straightened, his gaze never leaving the man before him. You've made your choice, Kale said quietly. Now you'll answer for it. Renar's composure returned, his lips curling into a bitter smile. Go ahead, then. Execute me. It won't change anything. The Empire will still come. And when they do, all of this, your resistance, your bravado, it will crumble. Kyle nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the truth in Renar's words. But when he spoke, his tone was unyielding. Maybe so, but they'll remember us. He turned to Mira. Take him to the brig. He'll answer for his crimes when this is over. Mira hesitated for a moment, as if expecting Kale to end it right then and there. But she nodded and gestured for the guards to take Renar away. The former commander didn't resist, though his bitter gaze lingered on Kale as he was led from the room. You're making a mistake, Renar called over his shoulder. They'll destroy you. Kale didn't respond. He watched in silence as the door closed behind the traitor, his shoulders tense. The room remained still, the echoes of the confrontation lingering like a shadow. Alara broke the silence, her voice measured but concerned. He's not entirely wrong, Kale. The Empire will come, and they'll hit harder than ever. Kale exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. I know. That's why we need to be ready. He turned back to the table, where the holographic display showed the remnants of Earth's defenses. The Arindis had been a victory, but it had come at a cost. Their remaining ships were spread thin and repairs were taking longer than anticipated. Supplies were running low, and morale was teetering on the edge. Kale's gaze shifted to Mira. What's the status on the data recovered from the shuttle? Mira tapped a few keys, bringing up a new projection. The encryption was tough, but our techs managed to crack it. It looks like the Empire was targeting our energy relays to bring down the shields. Renar's intel confirmed their positions. Kale nodded grimly. Then we need to move them. If they hit the relays, we're finished. Alara frowned. Relocating the relays will take time, and we're already stretched thin. Can we afford to divert resources? We can't afford not to, Kyle replied. If those shields fall, the stronghold won't last an hour under their fire. Mira folded her arms, her expression thoughtful. What about decoys? We could set up false relay signals, make them think they've hit the real targets. Kyle's lips curved into a faint smile. Now you're thinking like a tactician. Alara nodded slowly. It could work, but it'll only buy us time. If they realize the relays are intact, they won't, Kale interrupted. Not until it's too late. The plan began to take shape, a combination of deception and preparation that would force the Empire to waste valuable resources. Kale knew it wasn't a perfect solution, but perfection wasn't an option. They had to play every angle, exploit every weakness. As the meeting concluded, Kale lingered in the war room, his mind racing. Renard's words echoed in his thoughts, a constant reminder of the stakes. The Empire was coming, and this time they wouldn't hold back. But Cale also knew something Renard didn't. Humanity's greatest strength wasn't its numbers or technology. It was its refusal to surrender. Kyle looked up at the holographic display of the Dominion's wrath, its dark silhouette a looming threat. "You want us gone so badly?" he muttered under his breath. "Come and try." With that, he turned and left the war room, his resolve unshaken. The traitor was exposed, the defenses were being reinforced, and humanity's spirit burned brighter than ever. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, and Cale Draven would ensure that when the Empire struck again, Earth would be ready. The low hum of the stronghold's shields reverberated through the halls, a steady reminder of the precarious barrier standing between humanity and annihilation. Repairs on the decoys had begun, and Cale Draven had thrown every available hand into the effort. Time was slipping through their fingers, each second bringing the Empire closer to a decisive strike. Inside the war room, the tension was palpable. The holographic display of the Dominion's wrath loomed like a specter of doom. Around the table, Cale's officers exchanged quiet glances, their confidence shaken but not broken. "They're adjusting their formation," Lieutenant Mira Voss reported, her tone sharp as she analyzed the latest data. "The Dominion's wrath is moving into a forward position. It's not just leading the fleet anymore, it's preparing to strike." Cale's jaw tightened. He studied the projection, tracing the Empire's calculated maneuvers. The wrath was more than a weapon. It was a psychological statement. Its mere presence screamed invincibility, a symbol of the Empire's absolute dominance. "What about their smaller vessels?" Kyle asked, his voice steady. Mira adjusted the display, highlighting a cluster of ships surrounding the flagship. "Escorts are tightening their perimeter. They're fortifying the Wrath's defenses, likely anticipating retaliation after the Arindus." Cale nodded. "That means the cruisers are less guarded. They'll expect us to focus on the Wrath, but we can use this to our advantage." Dr. Alara Kane stepped forward, her face grave. "Cale, if the Wrath is moving into an offensive position, it means they're preparing to use their planet-killer weapon. The energy signatures we're tracking match those recorded during other planetary annihilations." "Then we don't have time," Cale replied, his voice resolute. "If they fire that weapon, it's over." Mira's gaze hardened. "You want to hit their supply line again, don't you?" Cale met her eyes. "Yes. If we cripple another key cruiser, it'll delay their advance and force them to rethink their strategy. We need to keep them on the defensive." Mira hesitated. "It's a gamble, Kyle. They're tightening their formation. Any strike team we send might not make it back." Cale's face was unreadable. "It's a risk we have to take. If we sit back, we're already dead." As the stronghold braced for the next move, Cale walked the corridors, taking in the quiet determination of his people. Engineers worked tirelessly to reinforce the decoys, their faces streaked with grime. Soldiers double-checked their weapons, their eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but alight with resolve. In the hangar, the air was electric with anticipation. Kyle approached the Resolute, where Mira was already waiting, running final checks on her own fighter. She glanced up as he approached, her expression a mix of defiance and concern. "You're flying point again, aren't you?" she asked. Kyle nodded. "I trust myself more than anyone else for this." Mira smirked faintly, though the worry in her eyes lingered. "One of these days, you're going to realize you can't carry the whole planet on your shoulders." "Not today," Cale replied, his tone firm but not unkind. "Are the pilots ready?" "They're ready," Mira said. "Scared, but ready." "Good," Kyle said. "Fear keeps us sharp." The strike team launched into the void, their ships cutting through the darkness like shards of light. Cale's voice came through the comms, calm and steady. "Remember the plan. Disrupt their supply chain, then pull out. Do not engage the Wrath directly." "Understood," Mira replied. "We've got your back." The fleet's advance was an ominous sight. Hundreds of Imperial ships moved in perfect unison, a mechanical symphony of destruction. At their center, the Dominion's Wrath loomed, its energy reading spiking as it prepared to charge its primary weapon. Kale focused on the task at hand, scanning for the cruiser marked as their target. It was a behemoth, bristling with weaponry but sluggish compared to its escorts. The Empire relied on overwhelming force, not speed, and Kale intended to exploit that weakness. "There it is," Mira called out. "Cruiser designation Orvis. It's carrying munitions for their forward fleet." Kale nodded. "Form up. Hit their engines first. Once they're crippled, we move to their weapon systems." The strike team moved as one, their ships breaking formation to surround the Orvis. Kale dove in first, his ship weaving through a hail of plasma fire as he targeted the cruiser's propulsion systems. His cannons roared, energy blasts slamming into the Orvis's shields. They flickered but held. "Shields are stronger than the Arindis," Mira reported. "We'll need to overload them." "Focus fire on the same spot," Kale ordered. "Force a breach." The team concentrated their fire, their coordinated assault overwhelming the cruiser's defenses. The shields finally gave way, and Kale's next volley tore into the engines. Explosions rippled across the Orvis, sending debris spiraling into space. "Engines disabled," Mira confirmed. "She's dead in the water." "Move to their weapons," Kale said. "Take out those cannons before they can recover." The team pressed their advantage, targeting the cruiser's weapon systems with precision strikes. Kale's Resolute led the charge, its maneuverability allowing him to dart between the enemy's counterattacks. The Orvis's cannons sputtered, then fell silent as explosions ripped through its frame. "Objective complete," Kale announced. "Fall back before they regroup." As the team pulled away, the Empire's fleet scrambled to respond. Fighters swarmed toward the Orvis, but it was too late. The damage was done, and the cruiser was crippled beyond repair. Back at the stronghold, the mood was grim, but determined. The strike had delayed the Empire's advance, but the Dominion's wrath remained an ever-present threat. Kyle and Mira stood in the war room, reviewing the latest data. "They're not pulling back," Mira said, her tone heavy. "If anything, they're accelerating their assault." Kyle nodded. "They'll want to make an example of us. The wrath is their ace, and they're getting ready to use it." Ilara joined them, her expression grave. "The energy signatures confirm it. They're charging their planet-killer weapon. We have hours, maybe less, before they fire." Kale's jaw clenched. "Then we need to force their hand. If we can bait them into a trap, we might have a chance." Mira frowned. "A trap? With what? We've barely got enough firepower to hold the line, let alone take on the wrath." Kale's gaze hardened. "We don't need firepower. We need precision, the Inferno Protocol." Ilara's eyes widened. "Kale, if we use the protocol, it'll devastate everything within range, including us." Kale's voice was quiet but firm. "If we don't use it, there won't be an us left to worry about." The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. Mira looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You really think this will work?" "It has to," Kale said simply. As preparations began, Kale took a moment to himself, stepping away from the chaos of the war room. He gazed out at the ruins of Earth, the once vibrant planet now a shell of its former glory. He thought of the people he had lost, the sacrifices made to bring them to this moment. The Empire thought humanity was broken, beaten. They were wrong. Kyle turned back to the war room, his resolve steeled. The noose was tightening, but humanity wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The stronghold vibrated with the relentless rhythm of preparation. Every corner was alive with activity, engineers fortifying shields, soldiers running drills, and technicians fine-tuning systems that had been patched together so many times they barely resembled their original designs. The entire structure felt like a living organism holding its breath. The Dominion's wrath was closing in, its colossal shadow a reminder of the stakes. Kale Draven stood in the war room, his face grim and determined, as he studied the holographic projection of the battlefield. The Empire's fleet was tightening its grip, with smaller cruisers repositioning to encircle Earth's last bastion. At the heart of the fleet, the Wrath glowed ominously, energy signatures spiking as it charged its planet-killer weapon. Time was running out. "Ilara, what's the status of the protocol?" Kyle asked, his voice sharp. Dr. Alara Kane, the architect of Earth's most dangerous weapon, stepped forward. Her face bore the lines of exhaustion, but her voice remained steady. The Inferno protocol is primed. The power core is stable, but barely. Once we activate it, the chain reaction will be unstoppable. The blast radius will encompass everything within 100,000 kilometers. And their fleet? Kyle asked. They'll be obliterated, Alara replied. But so will our outer defenses. The energy surge will overload our systems. We won't have anything left to stop them if it fails. Kale nodded. It won't fail. Mira Voss leaned against the console, her arms crossed. That's a big gamble, Kale. What if they figure out what we're doing before it's too late? They won't, Kale said. His tone was firm, but the weight of the decision bore heavily on him. The Wrath's commanders are arrogant. They'll come closer, thinking we're desperate, broken. That's when we hit them. Mira's lips thinned. She didn't argue, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her doubts. Then let's make sure we don't miss. The Empire's fleet advanced steadily, their formation tightening as they prepared for the final blow. Aboard the Dominion's Wrath, High Executor Varric stood on the command deck, his crimson eyes gleaming with anticipation. Humanity's defiance ends today, he declared, his voice carrying through the silent deck. Prepare to fire the primary weapon. Advisors around him moved with precision, inputting commands and calibrating the massive energy cannon that would annihilate Earth. Varric's confidence was unshakable. The humans were cornered, their resistance little more than a dying gasp. But as the Wrath loomed closer, subtle disruptions began to ripple through the fleet. Minor ships reported interference with their sensors, their systems scrambling to interpret false signals from the decoys set up by Kale's team. The Empire dismissed them as glitches until the interference began to spread. Varric frowned, his gaze narrowing. What is this? Unclear, Executor, an advisor replied. It appears to be a disruption from the planet's surface, but the source is undetectable. Varric's jaw tightened. Ignore it. Focus on the weapon. The humans are desperate. They'll try anything to delay the inevitable. In the stronghold, Kale watched as the Wrath moved closer, its massive form now filling the central display. The tension in the war room was suffocating. Everyone knew this was the endgame. If the protocol failed, there would be no second chance. Are the decoys holding? Kyle asked. Mira nodded. For now. The interference is buying us time, but they'll figure it out soon. Kale turned to Alara. Activate the protocol. Alara hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Understood. She moved to the control panel, her hands steady despite the enormity of what she was about to do. The protocol was more than a weapon. It was a last-ditch attempt to turn Earth itself into a weapon of mass destruction. Hidden beneath the stronghold, the core of the protocol began to hum, its energy building in a crescendo that could be felt throughout the structure. A low vibration resonated through the stronghold, growing in intensity. Technicians monitored the energy levels with a mix of awe and fear. The protocol's activation was unlike anything they had ever seen. Lights flickered, and the air seemed to thrum with raw power. Kyle watched the readings, his expression grim. We need to lure them closer. Mira, send the bait. Mira nodded and relayed the command. Moments later, a series of false signals were transmitted, mimicking the energy signatures of critical systems. The Empire's fleet, already on edge from the interference, began to adjust their formation, moving closer to investigate. They're taking the bait, Mira said, her voice taut. The Wrath is repositioning. Kale's gaze remained fixed on the display. Good. Keep them guessing. Aboard the Dominion's Wrath, Varric's irritation grew. The disruptions were escalating, and the fleet's attempts to pinpoint their source were met with dead ends. The humans' stubborn resistance was infuriating, but Varric refused to be deterred. Enough, he snarled. Prepare to fire. We'll end this now. Executor, the fleet is within close range, an advisor warned. The energy surge from the cannon could— I said fire, Varric roared. Humanity must learn there is no escape from the Empire's wrath. The massive cannon at the heart of the Wrath began to glow, its energy gathering into a blinding orb of destruction. The weapon's charge was a spectacle of terrifying beauty, a harbinger of annihilation. But as the weapon reached its peak, the protocol's trap was sprung. In the war room, Ilara's voice broke through the tension. "Energy levels are critical. The protocol is ready." Kale's eyes burned with determination. "Do it!" Ilara pressed the final command, and the protocol's core unleashed its fury. A surge of energy erupted from the stronghold, a chain reaction that raced outward at an unimaginable speed. The ground trembled violently, and the air ignited with a fiery brilliance as the protocol's full power was unleashed. The energy wave struck the Empire's fleet with devastating precision. Smaller ships were vaporized instantly, their hulls disintegrating into ash. The larger cruisers fared no better, their systems overloaded and torn apart by the sheer force of the blast. At the center of the maelstrom, the Dominion's wrath shuddered under the onslaught. Its shields, designed to withstand planetary bombardments, crumbled like paper under the protocol's wrath. Explosions rippled across its surface, tearing through its superstructure and igniting secondary blasts. On Earth, the stronghold's systems flickered and groaned under the strain of the protocol's activation. Kale braced himself as the tremors shook the war room, but his gaze never left the display. One by one, the red icons representing the Empire's fleet disappeared, consumed by the protocol's fury. "They're breaking," Mira said, her voice a mix of awe and disbelief. "The Wrath! It's collapsing!" Kyle watched as the Dominion's Wrath, the Empire's symbol of invincibility, finally succumbed. Its massive frame shattered, pieces of its hull spiraling into the void. A cheer erupted in the war room, but Kale didn't join in. His focus remained sharp, his resolve unyielding. "Status report," he ordered. Ilara's voice was steady despite the chaos. "The protocol's energy is stabilizing. The blast radius didn't reach the stronghold. We're still intact." Kyle nodded. "And the Empire?" Mira grinned, her expression fierce. "They're retreating. Whatever's left of their fleet is scattering. We did it." Kyle allowed himself a moment of relief, but it was fleeting. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. He turned to Mira and Ilara, his voice resolute. "Send the message." Mira nodded and began transmitting the signal. Kyle stepped forward, his face hard as steel as he spoke. "To the Galactic Empire, this was mercy. Challenge us again, and your worlds will burn." The transmission ended, and Kyle stood in the silence of the war room. The protocol had bought humanity a reprieve, but he knew the Empire wouldn't forget. They would return, stronger and angrier than ever. But when they did, Kale would be ready. Humanity would be ready. For now, they had survived, and survival was victory enough. The echoes of the Inferno Protocol's activation still lingered in the stronghold, an almost imperceptible hum reverberating through the walls. Despite the relative quiet that had settled over the base, the air was heavy with exhaustion and an uneasy tension. The battle had been won, if it could even be called that, but the cost of victory was painfully clear. Kale Draven stood on the observation deck, gazing out at the wreckage orbiting Earth. The sky above was littered with debris from the obliterated Imperial fleet, chunks of ships and glowing fragments drifting aimlessly. Among them were the remnants of the Dominion's Wrath, now nothing more than a broken carcass. Its destruction was a victory that would be remembered for generations, but Kale could only feel the weight of what it had taken to achieve it. Behind him, Mira Voss approached, her steps uncharacteristically slow. She stopped a few feet away, leaning against the railing. For a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like an invisible barrier. "You did it," she said finally, her voice quieter than usual. "We did it," Kale corrected, though his tone lacked its usual firmness. His eyes remained on the debris above. "At least for now." Mira studied him, noting the tension in his posture. She had seen Kale endure countless battles, weather impossible odds, and inspire hope when none seemed possible. But now, in the aftermath of their greatest victory, he seemed more burdened than ever. "Why does it feel like we lost?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "We stopped them. We destroyed their fleet. We're still standing." Kyle sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because we've seen what the Empire can do, Mira. This was a battle, not the war. They'll come back. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but they'll come. And next time, we might not have the Inferno Protocol or anything left to fight with. Mira didn't argue. She knew Kale was right. The Empire's arrogance had been shattered, but their rage would follow. Even now, the remnants of their fleet were likely regrouping, plotting their next move. "What do we do then?" she asked, her voice firmer now. "Wait for them to finish licking their wounds and come back stronger?" Kale finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "We rebuild, we regroup, and we prepare for the inevitable." In the lower levels of the stronghold, Dr. Alara Kane worked tirelessly alongside a team of engineers and scientists. The aftermath of the protocol's activation had left the base's systems in a precarious state. Shields were flickering, power was unstable, and critical infrastructure had been pushed to its breaking point. "Alara," one of the engineers called, his voice strained, "we're stabilizing the core, but the residual energy levels are still fluctuating. If we don't get them under control, we could have a catastrophic feedback loop." Alara wiped a bead of sweat from her brow, her sharp mind racing through potential solutions. "Redirect the excess energy to the auxiliary systems," she ordered. "It'll buy us time to reinforce the main grid." The engineer hesitated. "But that could leave us vulnerable if—" "I know the risks," Alara interrupted, her voice firm. "But if we don't act now, there won't be anything left to protect." The team worked quickly, following her lead. Despite the chaos, Ilara's presence brought a sense of order and focus. She had been the architect of the protocol, and now she was determined to ensure that humanity could survive its aftermath. As the systems began to stabilize, one of the younger technicians looked up from his console. "Dr. Kane, is it true? Did we really destroy the Wrath?" Ilara paused, her gaze softening as she looked at him. "Yes," she said simply. "We did." The technician's expression was a mix of relief and awe. "I never thought... they said it couldn't be done." Ilara managed a faint smile. "A lot of things they said couldn't be done have been proven wrong. Never underestimate what humanity can achieve when pushed to the edge." In the barracks, the mood was somber despite the victory. Soldiers sat in small groups, tending to wounds and sharing quiet conversations. Some had lost comrades in the battle, their absence a painful reminder of the cost of survival. Grace Torrin, the leader of Theta Squadron, sat on the edge of her bunk, her helmet resting on her lap. Her squad had been instrumental in the success of the strike on the Orvis, but the mission had come at a heavy price. 2 of her pilots hadn't made it back, their ships lost in the chaos. One of her remaining wingmen, a young pilot named Rylan, approached hesitantly. "Captain Torrin," he said, his voice wavering, "we're organizing a memorial for those we lost. Thought you'd want to know." Grace nodded, her expression hard to read. "I'll be there." Rylan lingered for a moment. "Do you think it was worth it?" he asked quietly. "All of this?" Grace looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "It has to be. Otherwise, what's the point?" Rylan nodded, though her words didn't seem to ease his doubts. He turned and walked away, leaving Grace alone with her thoughts. She stared at her helmet, the scratches and scorch marks a testament to the battles they'd fought. She didn't know if it was worth it, but she knew they didn't have the luxury of doubting their choices. As the day wore on, Kyle convened a meeting in the war room with his senior staff. The holographic display still showed the aftermath of the battle, the debris field slowly drifting into the atmosphere. "Our defenses are holding for now," Mira reported. "The decoys worked better than expected, but we're running out of resources to maintain them. If the Empire comes back—" "When?" Kale corrected. "When they come back." Mira nodded grimly. "When they come back, we'll be in worse shape than we are now." Kale looked to Ilara. "What about the protocol? Can it be reactivated?" Ilara shook her head. "Not without months of repairs, and even then, we don't have the energy reserves to fire it again. It was always meant to be a last resort, Kyle. We can't rely on it." Kyle leaned on the table, his mind racing. The battle had proven that humanity could fight back, but their survival would depend on more than just weapons. They needed allies, resources, and time, things that seemed impossible to obtain in the shadow of the Empire. "We need to think bigger," Kyle said finally. "The Empire knows we're a threat now. If we're going to survive, We need to take the fight to them. Mira raised an eyebrow. You're talking about going on the offensive? Kyle nodded. It's the only way. We've been on the defensive for too long. If we can strike their supply lines, disrupt their operations, maybe even find allies who've been hiding in the shadows, we might stand a chance. Ilara frowned. And if we don't? Kyle's gaze was hard, unyielding. Then we make sure they remember us. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the group. They had survived the Empire's wrath, but the road ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger. Yet despite the odds, Kyle's resolve remained unshaken. Humanity wasn't finished. Not yet. For now they had bought themselves time, and time, Kyle knew, was the most valuable weapon they had. The observation deck was silent, save for the faint hum of the stronghold's power systems. Kale Draven stood alone, staring out at the void where the Empire's fleet had once loomed. Now, only debris and the fading remnants of fire streaked the sky. Earth had won a reprieve, but the cost of survival weighed heavily on him. His reflection in the reinforced glass was that of a man who had seen too much, endured too much, but who refused to crumble under the weight of it all. The stars beyond the glass twinkled faintly, indifferent to the conflict that had just unfolded. Somewhere out there, the remnants of the Empire's fleet were regrouping, their vengeance simmering beneath their shattered arrogance. Behind him, the soft hiss of the door opening broke the quiet. Mira Voss stepped in, her presence grounding as always. She approached silently, stopping a few feet behind him. For a moment she said nothing, letting the stillness linger. "They'll come back," she said finally, her voice steady but subdued. Kale nodded, his gaze never leaving the stars. "I know." "We're not ready for another fight," Mira continued. "The protocol can't be used again. Our fleet is barely holding together. Supplies are—" "I know," Kyle interrupted, his tone calm but firm. "But we have something they didn't expect." Mira frowned. "What's that?" Kyle turned to face her, his eyes burning with quiet determination. "Fear. The Empire doesn't know fear, not the kind we've shown them. They thought they were invincible, but now they know the truth. We made them bleed." Mira studied him for a moment, then gave a faint nod. "So, what's the plan?" Kyle stepped past her, heading toward the war room. "We remind them of what we're capable of, and we make sure the galaxy knows it too." The war room was quiet when Kale entered, its usual hum of activity subdued in the aftermath of the battle. Dr. Ilara Kane was already there, poring over diagnostics on the protocol systems. She glanced up as Kale entered, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "Captain," she said, straightening, "we're still stabilizing the core. It'll be weeks, maybe months, before we can fully assess the damage." Kale nodded. "Understood, but we're not here to talk about repairs." Ilara raised an eyebrow. "Then what are we here to talk about?" Kyle stepped to the central console, activating the holographic display. The image of Earth appeared, surrounded by a field of debris that stretched into the void. "We're sending a message." Mira entered the room behind him, taking her place by his side. "A message? To who?" "To everyone," Kale replied. "The Empire thinks they can crush us, that their power makes them untouchable. It's time we reminded them, and the rest of the galaxy, that humanity doesn't break." Ilara folded her arms, her expression skeptical. "And how do you plan to do that?" Kale's gaze was steely. "By showing them what happens when they underestimate us." The transmission room was deep within the stronghold, its systems ancient but functional. Technicians worked quickly to align the signal, ensuring it would reach every corner of the galaxy. It was a risk, revealing their position so blatantly, but Kale knew it was necessary. Fear wasn't enough. The galaxy needed to see humanity's resolve. Kale stood in front of the recording device, his uniform still scorched and tattered from the battle. He didn't bother to fix it. Let them see the scars. Let them see what survival looked like. Mira stood off to the side, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "Signal is ready," one of the technicians said. "We're live in 10 seconds." Kyle took a deep breath, his mind racing through everything he wanted to say. This wasn't just about the Empire. It was about the billions of lives that had been lost, the sacrifices that had brought them to this moment. The galaxy had to know that Earth would not go quietly into the night. The countdown reached 0, and the transmission began. Kyle stepped forward, his voice steady and unyielding. "This is Captain Kale Draven, speaking from Earth, the last bastion of humanity. To the Galactic Empire and to anyone who may be watching, hear these words. We are not afraid of you." His eyes burned into the lens, his presence commanding. "You came to our world thinking we would bow. You thought your strength, your numbers, your technology would be enough to break us. But you were wrong." Kale's voice grew sharper, laced with anger and defiance. "You have underestimated humanity for the last time. We may be battered, we may be broken, but we are not defeated. Today you learned what happens when you push us too far. Today you saw the cost of your arrogance." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "To the rest of the galaxy, know this. Humanity does not surrender. We do not kneel. We fight, and we endure. If you think you can take what is ours, if you think you can crush our spirit, then come. But be prepared to pay the price." Kale stepped closer, his expression fierce. "This is not a threat. It is a promise. To the Galactic Empire, this was mercy. If you come for us again, your worlds will burn.